This is a poem from Adam Zagajewski. It's from Poems to Live By in Uncertain Times, a wonderful little anthology that was published very shortly after 9/11, and I think it says a lot about our times that this book continues to remain extremely pertinent, and I use it constantly. Try to praise the mutilated world. Remember June's long days and wild strawberries, drops of wine, the dew, the nettles that methodically overgrew the abandoned homesteads of exiles. You must praise the mutilated world. You watched the stylish yachts and ships. One of them had a long trip ahead of it, while salty oblivion awaited others. You've seen the refugees heading nowhere. You've heard the executioners sing joyfully. You should praise the mutilated world. Remember the moments when we were together in a white room and the curtain fluttered? Return in thought to the concert where music flared. You gathered acorns in the park in autumn, and leaves eddied over the earth's scars. Praise the mutilated world and the gray feather a thrush lost, and the gentle light that strays and vanishes and returns. So this topic of forgiveness and forgiveness in community, and particularly in this community and in light of this covenant. And I hope everyone has this covenant, those members of this community. If you don't, ask for one, ask for a copy. I'm sure it was distributed, but I know you can get a copy. It's a wonderful thing to study and look at on a regular basis. This past week, before the events in France took our attention away, there was a column in the New York Times by Charles Blow, an editorial writer. And he wrote of the police officers who were demanding an apology from Mayor de Blasio for what they perceived as running an anti-police campaign. So they took the opportunity to use one of their colleagues' funerals to demand an apology for something that happened sometime in the past. He wrote this: "Who is to apologize for the poor form of hundreds, possibly thousands of petulant police officers for using their fallen colleagues' funerals to demonstrate a political grievance? And who is to apologize to the family of Eric Gardner? Who is to apologize to all the Eric Garners and Erica Garners? Do their lives not deserve honoring, remembering, some modicum of justice? And to broaden the scope, who is to apologize for bias in policing in general and generations of racially biased criminal justice, both of which have contributed to mass incarceration? There are some apologies owed, to be sure, for a legacy of wrongs and present ones, and some of those apologies need to come from the very people demanding them." And those are the words of the editorial in the New York Times. Now, perhaps an editorial could be written just as eloquently from the other side. I don't know. I didn't read one. But that is a huge standoff, to be sure. And you know from my message of many weeks ago kind of which side I'm on in this particular, if there are sides. But this standoff encompasses a lot. It encompasses much of the nation, and in some ways the world, because it touches upon so many deeper issues: racism, bias, violence, freedom of speech, freedom in general, freedom of expression, intolerance, and bigotry. But every interpersonal conflict in groups of people for which forgiveness or apologies are demanded or given or expected has some similar dynamics. Be it as small in scope as a neighborhood committee, or as large as an entire congregation, or a nation. So to think about forgiveness, we have to take a step back and think about what's the forgiveness all about? The conflict. So we'll start a little bit with conflict. I'm going to propose that we can't really avoid conflict, nor should we. Conflict is part of living. It's part of humanity. It's not only inevitable, it's actually desirable. It serves a function. It's necessary. It is to be desired. As a species, we are fascinated with conflict, and we love competition. Where's the person with the Eagles costume on this morning? I mean, come on. We gotta have it on 24/7. They might lose. We love it. Look, down in Kentucky, I don't even want to tell you, you can't go out from November to March and everybody's wearing blue for the Wildcat, for the basketball team, excuse me. You can't even wear red in Lexington or blue in Louisville. Is this not true, Michael Hart? Can you testify? And Marjorie also, my daughter, lives there. We love conflict. We're to thrive on it. If we don't do it ourselves, we can do it vicariously. But have you ever tried to read or write a story with no conflict? This is not good writing. Think about your favorite movie, TV show, play. What makes it rich and rewarding? What makes life rich and rewarding? A certain amount of conflict. Why do you think people visit the Colosseum in Rome? Because of the architecture? Really? Why do they go to Civil War battlefields? To see what kind of wildflowers are growing there? So we let's admit it, that conflict is important to us. It serves purpose. It makes us alive. But beyond acknowledging that conflict is necessary, and it even holds fascination for us, there are people who thrive on conflict. There are also people who thrive on conflict. Some of these people are anarchists. Some of them even call themselves anarchists. Do you remember, there's so much has happened since 2011 that maybe this has faded a bit in your memory, but there were riots in London, and then they spread quickly throughout Great Britain in 2011. They actually started with the killing of a young person of color by the police. But then they just became riots. They became these unfocused riots that people of all races and nationalities were participating in. They were just riots. They were nothing like the protests in Ferguson. They were just riots. Does anybody remember this? They were all over. It's been a really big thing that went on for weeks. After a couple of days, the people who were in the riots didn't even know. They could not even answer the question, what had sparked the riots. But they were fully engaged in violence against other people and against property. When they were asked, some of them said, we're just doing it because we can, to show that we can do it. My guess would be that conflict made them feel vital, engaged, and alive. There's all too little in some people's marginal existence to feed their spirit. So like the people who flocked to Jerry Springer and the WWF, which is not the WWF anymore because that's now the World Wildlife Federation. I don't know what it's called, but whatever. It used to be the WWF. The wrestlers that hit each other over the head with the metal chair. Whatever it's called now, nobody probably wants to admit it because then you'd be admitting that you still watch it. They watch or engage in meaningless conflict for its own sake. And this can give people what they sadly lacked, a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, a sense of joy, a sense of engagement with the world. Well, I'm going to say right now that many of those things can come from being a part of a true community where a certain amount of conflict can be engaged in safely. It doesn't have to be avoided, but it has to be managed safely. Scott Peck, who wrote The Road Less Traveled, the book most people know him for, wrote this lesser known but really excellent opus on community building called The Different Drum. Anyone familiar with The Different Drum? Several people. He writes there, also, quite old. I mean, it's 15 to 20 years old, but it's still pertinent, that conflict is an essential phase of community life, but that it's our response to the conflict, how we handle it, that makes the difference as to whether we will move into true community or back into a kind of false, or what he calls pseudo-community. He says that in this first stage, he calls it pseudo-community, well-intentioned people try to demonstrate their ability to be friendly and sociable. Perhaps you've experienced this in committees or communities that you've been a part of. But they don't really go beneath the surface of each other's ideas or emotions, and there's a lot of avoidance of conflict. This may look like community, but really no one will ever evolve or change in this group, either as individuals or as a group. Then, if people stay together and continue together, there is what he calls a time of chaos. And he says this is the first step toward community, when there's a period of negativity. Somehow this mutually sustained facade of niceness is shattered. Members start to vent their frustrations, their annoyances, and their differences, and negative emotions flood through. This is the time, he says, the time of chaos. He says this is actually a good time. He calls it beautiful chaos. Oh, well, I'm not sure that I would agree that it's always beautiful. It really depends on what happens during that time. He says that in order to transcend the stage of chaos, people must shed things. People must give up the things that are preventing real communication. And that's where I think the key is. I think the key is that something has got to be given up. If people who are in this community, be it a small group or a large group, are unwilling to give up some of these things, what will happen will either be that the community, whatever it may be, will dissolve, or there will be a step back into a false community, a pseudo-community. Niceness, but no one really growing, nothing really true ever developing. He stresses that in order for communities to move from discord and chaos into peace and harmony and deeper community, more genuine community, something must be relinquished or given up. To me, this is the essence and core of forgiveness. This giving up is living in forgiveness, not I'm sorry, okay, I forgive you. Will you forgive me? Yes, I forgive you. We all forgive each other. Okay, let's be nice now. It's living into with the letting go and the giving up and the giving up. Okay, what is it that we're going to have to give up? This is the hard part. He says there are only two ways to community, through organization and what he calls emptiness. In the latter, there was this time of letting go. In the former, structures are imposed from above or without, and in the former, it can lead back to pseudo-community. In other words, when you just try to organize it from above with too many rules, too much structure, you can go back into pseudo-community. But in this letting go, what we have to let go of, about to tell you, we can go to true community. Okay, what is it? Are you ready? Attach pillow to forehead so you can bang your head on the desk. Expectations, preconceptions, prejudices. I'm not talking about racial prejudices. I'm talking about prejudging any group of people. Ideology, theology, solutions, the need to heal, convert, fix, or solve. And this is the hardest one of all, the need to control. Anybody not have any of those things that they would ever need to give up? Come on, when we enter into a community, it's because, like I said, be it a neighborhood committee, a congregation, a work, whatever it is, community that we enter into, it's because we have something that we want to be a part of, or we've chosen to be a part of. Of course, we have some of these issues, and letting go of them is so hard. It's so difficult. It's so difficult to just take that step back and listen. And what if you're letting go and everybody else is controlling everything? What the heck? I'm just going to sit here and let go and everybody else is going to control everything? That doesn't seem right. Little story. In the congregation that I last served, there is a wonderful man who has been the patriarch of the congregation for 50 years. He was a young professor when it started, over 60 years ago, when the congregation started. Helped run the congregation. He's the largest contributor to the congregation. Michael's going to know who I'm talking about. And anyway, it would be fine if he heard me because this is a true story and I would tell it if he were here. He and his wife are the matriarch and patriarch. I really thought when I got there, 15 years ago, I would be doing their memorial services, but they're still there. They're still alive. And they're wonderful people, okay? They're wonderful people. Bless their hearts. But he never, ever said anything to me until when I was leaving, I found out that he and this other gentleman they were inviting this man to come speak, and they told the secretary, and she tells me, she's like, blah, blah, and such person want to have this last interim minister who was there before I came to come to speak on April such and such, and they want to know if that's okay with you. And I'm like, first of all, no, they have to talk to me because I'm the one who plans out the worship calendar. They need to come to me and talk to me about it. And secondly, why do they want to have him to come to speak? I don't understand why. So I go to them after church and I'm like, what are you thinking about in having this person come to speak? Well, he says to me, well, we were thinking that possibly we could engage him as our interim minister. I had already announced that I was leaving, I announced 9 months ahead of time. So I didn't leave with any surprise or anything. And that was when I lost my, calm exterior that ministers are always supposed to have, which I didn't really lose hardly ever for 14 years. I mean, I was usually very calm. I'm like, no, you cannot do this. There is a system. The UUA has a system. You have to, this is a 300-member congregation. You cannot arrange for your own interim minister. I started being like, no, you can't. You cannot do that. You cannot do that. So finally, we're going back and forth. This is after church and people are milling around. I'm like, you can't do that. And so finally it comes out after we're talking back and forth for a long time that he starts telling me, well, when XYZ person was here, when this congregation was 10 or 15 years old, he did all these discretions. We tried to contact the UUA and they never helped us out. They never got rid of him. They never got him out of ministry. I'm like, I know that, Bob. We've been through this. We've been over this. That was 40 years ago. I'm like, do you really, none of those people are even at the UUA anymore. They're dead. I mean, seriously. And I was like, are you telling me that you do not trust the UUA to find you an interim minister? And he says, no, I don't trust the UUA. And then I was like, okay. Now there's an opening. Now the window has opened. The doves can fly in. You know what I mean? It was like, okay, thank you. 14 years later. I mean, that was a really big thing. He, and maybe me to some extent too, we had never let go or he had never let go of some of that stuff, these ideologies, these prejudices, these things. And maybe I had never created the opportunity for it. I mean, it was huge. So of course I talked with the interim and here's your opening, here's your opportunity, here's something to work with going forward. He's one of the most influential people, even if he is 94, in that congregation. Okay, that was a long story, but I hope it made sense to you because you are also a congregation. You're not 60 years old and such, but wow, talk about holding on to something. And none of us are exempt. None of us are exempt. And, if I'm pointing a finger at you, I've got how many pointing back at me, as they say in the 12-step programs. None of us are exempt, including me. We can hold on so long to something and not even realize that we are holding on to it. But he was still not trusting the Unitarian Universalist Association, which is who? It's all of us. There's nobody there who could even possibly have remembered anything that he was still punishing them for. They got a good interim, and I'm praying and hoping they're going to call a wonderful minister this coming year. All right, there's much in Peck's vision of community to resonate with, but I want to add a little bit to Peck. He wrote the different drum before either family systems or appreciative inquiry were introduced into conflict and community building. So just a few little add-ons there. When he described community after emptiness as this blissful time of peace and harmony, he said it was much like falling in love. He's writing about time-limited communities, and I think many of us have experienced that. If you go to a workshop, it's a week long, you go through this chaos, everybody then hears each other out, you let go of your things, you do feel that. But that's a time-limited thing. That's a closed workshop. He freely acknowledges that long-term communities, families, congregations, and organizations must do the agonizing work of return through chaos, emptiness, again and again, if true community is to be maintained. So here's the little bit to be added. Starhawk points out in her seminal work, Truth or Dare, that community can never be reached in groups that are entirely open. So she says true community can never be reached in groups that are entirely open. Groups, she says, must have boundaries, not barriers, but boundaries, in order to be truly safe spaces. So maybe it's unrealistic for, a congregation, for example, since we happen to be in a congregation right now, to have an expectation that it be a true community of the kind that Scott Peck is talking about, okay? And yet to strive for a feeling of community within the community, yes, I think that's reasonable. But this ideal of this perfect community, maybe not ideal, right? But she says if no process exists for asking someone to leave a group, what generally happens is that productive, amiable members all drop out one by one, the group dissolves, and the tasks remain undone. How many times have we seen that happen in congregations? Plenty. Plenty of times. And so that's one reason that the board here is actually working on what they're calling a disruptive persons policy so that people can be kindly asked to not necessarily leave the congregation, but to consider how their behavior is affecting others. And that's good. Almost every UU congregation has this now. We're really looking at how the needs of one person don't trump the needs of everyone else, so we don't lose our productive people. I think that's cool. Starhawk is an advocate for what she calls creative conflict. The goal, she says, of creative conflict is to emerge more united, more whole, and more balanced, not to win or to destroy the other person. And that's really a great goal, I think. A feeling that everyone has listened to each other and won. Humans, she says, faced with fear generally function less than optimally. Either they harden into determined opposing positions or they revert to what Buddhism calls aversion. When the Buddha was really talking about, what the Buddha was talking about is really its biology. It's the amygdala that evokes the freeze, fight, or flight, or fight response that is most common when humans are faced with conflict. But this doesn't have to be so. There is one community that I'm a part of that I think is a wonderful example of how conflict or disagreement can happen because we disagree as humans and can happen safely. And that is the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Facebook discussion group. And I think it happens because there are boundaries. There is a moderator who reminds people if they're being offensive. We have an agreed upon covenant, and we're able to say, I disagree with you. We had a big disagreement this week about the situation in France. It wasn't that people felt that it should have happened, but some people felt, well, yes, this magazine is Islamophobic and their cartoons were horrible. I was actually thinking, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? This is freedom. I'm on the side of like, this is freedom of speech. This is terrible. This is liberty. This is freedom of speech. This never should have happened. That, whether or not you disagree with it, they should be allowed to print it. And other people saying they should have been shut down because they were Islamophobic. They were blah, blah. Anyway, there was kind of getting into this discussion, but people were able to take a step back, read more articles, look at it, listen to one another. And I felt like writing something like, are we going to have to call them freedom fries again? I felt like the French people, I felt like the poor French people were getting, really trashed. They're Islamophobic, they're anti-Semitic, they're this, they're that. The whole French people, like all the French people all together. But I was in the unusual position of defending France, which I don't have any particular ties to France, but I am tied to freedom of speech. So, people could have gotten like that. They could have gotten really nasty with each other. But in that group, in that Facebook group, there is a system. There is a way in which we are able to say, rather than saying that, what I did was I asked a question. I said, do you really think that the government should have silenced that magazine? I just asked the question, to see if they really believed that. I just wanted to see, do you really think the government should have silenced that magazine? And then I also took some time, because since I was taking that position, I took some time to read a little bit more about what the magazine was doing. Truth be told, I didn't really know what some of the things were. So I read something from a French person who did read it, did look at it, and was it really Islamophobic? Was it really that bad, et cetera, et cetera. So taking the time to listen, taking the time to step back, and having a agreed upon basis for these discussions. We need to have them. We need to have them. We can't avoid them. We can't just get fearful and run away. The aversion to conflict, the fear of conflict is worse. That's worse. We're never going to move forward as a people if that's all we do. Okay. Family Systems counsels that managing our anxiety in a system or in a community means having a self, So that is the key question for you to take home. So you can't control whether everybody else is going to let go of things or not, but you can work on yourself. Do you have a self? Sure I do. That sounds easy enough. Of course I have a self. I'm 60 years old. I have a self. Actually, having and maintaining self-differentiation is one of the hardest relational tasks. Oh my God, I better shut up. What are my colleagues going to think of me if I take the position and 9 out of 10 people are on the other position? No, I better do what everybody else thinks is cool. No, I have a self. I know why I think what I think. I've been 20 years in this thing, but I'll step back and think about it, but then I have a self. I have a solid self. When we can live from our own solid core of self and refuse to be pulled back into fused negativity or unhealthy triangles. Triangles are another thing family systems talk about. We are living with forgiveness. Why? Because we're forgiving ourselves and the other, just as the covenant says here, for being human, for being less than perfect, and for being different from one another. We're honoring our own and one another's integrity and humanity by communicating directly, having realistic expectations, and looking for the best. So finally, appreciation, appreciative inquiry, along with family systems, they're two of the best tools for living and being in relationship. Looking for what's best, what went well, and what goes well. So much goes well. There's so much to be grateful for still, even in a mutilated world. You can find it. And remembering the greater purpose, Selma, okay? When she talks about Selma, right? We did that. We didn't do Selma, excuse me. I don't mean the Unitarians did Selma. We only had to see, we had a little tiny part. I'm not taking the credit for Selma. The people did some of the civil rights people, but we did that little part. We were there, we were there as a denomination. We can look at what we have done as a denomination, and we have a bigger purpose here. Step up to it. We can step up to it. We have something big to do in this community and in this world. Thinking about what we're really here for are the elemental parts of building a relationship, a partnership, a family, a team, a community. Scott Peck writes, "What repeatedly draws me into community is something more. When I'm with a group of human beings committed to hanging in there through both the agony and the joy of community, I have a dim sense that I am participating in a phenomenon for which there's only one word. I almost hesitate to use it. The word," he says, "is glory." Amen.